Good morning, friends. So, welcome to this second session on balancing of rotating and reciprocating machines. Yesterday, we had talk about why we need balancing in the first place. So, we'll just revisit some of the important concepts that we had looked through. So, the first thing that we understood is that there are two kinds of unbalanced problem in rotating machines. One is in a single plane unbalance, such as in this case of a rotating cam. So, if you have a rotating cam of this sort, the rotating cam will obviously rotate about an axis which is shown here in a white circle. So, the axis of the rotating cam, axis of rotation for the cam is passing through this point, whereas the center of mass is somewhere else. So, therefore, as this cam is rotating, this mass will rotate, and once the mass rotates, there is a centrifugal force which is now borne out because the mass is rotating. The value of that centrifugal force is me omega square. So, the inertia forces on the cam is equals to the unbalanced force that is being transmitted onto the frame, and the exact magnitude of it is me omega square. The exact orientation of it is aligned exactly with the center of mass of the cam. So, as the cam rotates, the center of mass rotates, and therefore, this unbalanced force and hence the shaking force also starts rotating. So, therefore, with respect to a fixed direction, you will always get to see that you have a sinusoidal type of force that is being experienced in along x or y direction on the frame. So, the frame is subjected to a rotating force of constant magnitude, but therefore, the unbalanced force along any direction, call it x, call it y or whatever, that will vary harmonically at an angular frequency omega. So, the magnitude is me omega square, and the time variation of this force would be sinusoidal with a single frequency, which is cos omega t plus phi is the time dependent. So, that was the case when you have a single disc which is rotating. But then the more involved problem is when you have a number of such discs like we had in the case of turbo machinery. So, just to give you a motivating application, in turbo machinery you had a number of such unbalances placed along the axial direction. So, in each of these rows of blades you could have unbalances. The question is how we would be able to tackle this problem. So, towards that end we had made some conventions, and just to refresh your memory, instead of talking I will play out a movie which will actually refresh the sign conventions that we had talked of in the previous class. So, I hope you can see my screen, which is showing a video. So, let me pause and play for you. So, this is the configuration of the blue color shows the axis of the rotating shaft, and on this rotating shaft there are two unbalanced masses which are mounted. This could comprise two rows of turbine blades with different masses as at an eccentric position, and therefore okay, I am sorry, my support member just told me that I was not using the right options. So, I'll do that again. So, now possibly you are able to see the video uh, of this unbalanced mass. So, there are two rows of unbalance that are depicted here. The blue line over here shows the axis of rotation, and there are two unbalanced masses placed at different axial locations. So, this is the exact physical configuration. These unbalanced masses corresponds, let us say, to the two rows of turbine blades which are due to manufacturing variabilities have produced different unbalances. Now, it is obvious that as these unbalances are, the orientation of the unbalances exactly correspond to the orientation of the unbalanced force. If you observe, the orientation of the unbalanced mass and the orientation of the unbalanced force vector is exactly the same, because the unbalanced force vector is nothing but the centrifugal force. So, the centrifugal force direction will obviously correspond to the direction of the unbalanced masses, but the moment direction, which is shown in red arrows here, is 90 degree is having an orientation which is 90 degree shifted to that of the forces, but for the unbalanced force which lies to the right of my reference plane. So, this is the reference plane. which lies to the right, then there you see the red arrow, which is the moment, the actual moment is rotated by 90-degree counterclockwise, whereas here it is rotated. So there are these unbalanced masses. So these unbalanced masses are producing the forces this way. So the moment would be indicated in the following fashion. The moment which is on the right of my reference plane will be rotated 90-degree clockwise. The red is rotated 90-degree clockwise, the green is rotated 90-degree clockwise, whereas the blue, which is on the left of the reference plane, will be rotated in 90-degree counterclockwise. So therefore, when you undertake a full counterclockwise rotation, this red arrow, which is the actual moment, is going to get aligned with the actual forces, which in turn is aligned with the actual unbalanced masses, and therefore the green arrow also shows the similar feature, that is the actual moment. If you rotate by counterclockwise direction, then the rotated moment will be in alignment with the actual forces, whereas those unbalances which are lying to the left of the reference plane will show an opposite trend. That is, for the blue arrow, you will get to see that if it is rotated counterclockwise, it is in this fashion, and now the blue arrow is opposite to the blue arrow in the force diagram. So this is something that we studied in the last class. So that was just to refresh your memory. Now we will take a formal approach and try to formalize this algorithm to something which can be easily solved in pen and paper or even in an Excel sheet. So this is what we have. Suppose we are given unbalance in the planes 1, 2 up to n with unbalances m1, e1, m2, e2, mn, an. So these unbalances are present in the system, and let's say due to some with some experimentation you have determined these unbalanced the amount of the unbalances and also their angular orientation. By the way, that reminds me that I have posted in the course pack an experimental method of determination of the magnitude and orientation of unbalances, which is which was what some of the students were asking yesterday. So please visit the course pack, and therein you will be able to find out how experimentally these unbalances can be determined, both in terms of the magnitude as well as the angular orientation. But obviously the curriculum does not permit such a discussion because it will take us too far astray. But I like the question, and I encourage you to read it on your own for your own understanding. Okay, carrying forward, the objective is to add two unbalances in the, and we call those planes 0 and n, 0 and n plus 1. This should be n plus 1. We will add two unbalances in the planes 0 and n plus 1 such that the sum of the moments and the sum of the forces should be 0 after this addition. So we wish to add m0 e0 in the balanced plane 0 and mn plus 1 en plus 1 in the unbalanced plane n plus 1 such that the total forces and total moments may get added to 0 after this addition is accomplished. So let us see what happens. So first, if we look at the moments, and let us take the moments about the balanced plane 0. So if our reference plane is taken as plane 0, then the total moment as per this convention would be me times x is the magnitude of it, and you should take both cos theta as well as sin theta components. So as I said, the actual unbalances are 1 to n, and then you put two more 0 and n plus 1. Please read this as n plus 1, not n, and therefore you have to take a summation on it. But now, as I said, remarked the other day that you should be smart in your choice of reference plane. So therefore, if we choose the reference plane to be exactly coinciding with the 0 plane, then the distance of the reference plane from the 0 plane is just 0. So therefore, x0 can be turned as 0 in this case by mere choice, a smart choice I would say, of the reference plane to be coinciding with the 0 plane. And when you do that, instead of a summation from 0 to n plus 1, you have a summation from 1 to n plus 1. And similarly here, if you have a summation, you have a summation from 1 to n plus 1. So you have to add both cos theta component as well as the sin theta component. Now in this summation is supposed to give you 0, but then out of all this summation you don't know only the last terms, that is mn plus 1, en plus 1, and you also don't know theta n plus 1. So we will see this will exactly lead us to the solution wherein we will be able to find both the unbalanced amount mn plus 1 en plus 1 and theta n plus 1. Now once this is determined, then we return to the so if we use this equation, we should be able to determine both theta n plus 1 and mn plus 1 en plus 1, because in this summation these are the only three unknowns. So if you take the ratio, for example, of these two, you should be able to determine tan theta n plus 1, and if you know tan theta n plus 1, you should be able to determine theta n plus 1. And similarly, if you square and add it up, theta will get eliminated and you should be able to determine mn plus 1 en plus 1. This is exactly what we will do in a problem in a minute's time. But now that we have determined, so one of our objectives has been fulfilled at this stage, that is we have been able to determine the unbalanced amount mn plus 1 en plus 1, which has to be put on the unbalanced plane n plus 1, and we have also been able to determine the orientation of the unbalanced theta n plus 1, such that we at least achieve the objective of moment balance. But then we remember there is also force balance which has to be done, and when we do the force balance now, we have to account for the unbalance present in the plane 0. Remember, by our smart choice of coinciding the reference plane with the plane 0, the moment balance did not involve anything about the plane 0. So therefore we are now left with the force equilibrium condition, and in the force equilibrium condition we find that you will get terms of the form of m0 e0 cos theta 0 to start with, similarly m0 e0 sin theta 0 to start with, and when you sum this over all the unbalances, this should be 0. But at this stage the only unknown in both these summations are m0 e0 and theta 0. So again, using a similar procedure as here, we can determine tan theta 0 as the ratio of these two numbers, and then we can also determine the value of m0 by squaring and taking the sum of it. So I will demonstrate the calculation procedure through an example, which is what I plan to do. So before going to that calculation procedure, let us try and show you what we want to do. So it is just a tabular method. In the tabular method, we will write a neat kind of table that is shown here. So we will compile all the unbalanced planes 0, 1, n plus 1, and associated with each of these planes we will have m0, e0, m1, e1 up to mn plus 1, en plus 1. So these are the value of the unbalances at each of the planes starting from 0 to n plus 1. Remember, 0 and the n plus 1 planes are the planes where you want to put the requisite unbalances. After the addition of these requisite unbalances, the system should be balanced. So the plane from 1 to n are the unbalanced planes which are naturally there in the manufacturing system, in the machine system that you are analyzing, and your objective is to put some unbalance m0 e0 at an angle theta 0 and another unbalance mn plus 1 en plus 1 at an angle theta n plus 1, such that everything now gets balanced with this addition. So therefore we just simply tabulate the data as a first step, and then we find the couple vector and the force vector, and we find it along the two components, the z axis and the y axis. If you recall, the x axis is along the direction of the shaft. So the z axis is basically the horizontal direction in the left side view, and therefore the vertical direction corresponds to positive y. So we are resolving all the forces and all the rotated moments along the z and y direction. So therefore you have a cos theta component which is showing the z direction, and you have a sin theta component which is showing the y direction. And please note, we are talking about the rotated moments, we are not talking about the actual moments. And here you will find that our convention is really helpful, because the cos theta sin theta components are exactly the same between the force and the rotated moment. It is the other way round. It is whatever is cos theta in the actual force will be sin theta in the moment diagram. So that will cause some confusion. To avoid that confusion, we have created this convention wherein we have rotated the moments. So therefore in the rotated moment diagram, you will find out the components which are merely cos theta and sin theta, and then try and equate them to 0, and similarly you will try and equate them to 0. When you try to equate them, you will get to see that there are some unknowns, and when you are solving for these unknowns, you will be able to determine the requisite amount of unbalances M0 E0, Mn plus 1 and En plus 1 that has to be added, as well as the orientation of these unbalances which has to be added, such that these columns, all these 4 columns should add up to 0. So with that, let us now take a problem to demonstrate the procedure. So here is an example that I have actually taken from the book, but hopefully it will demonstrate the purpose. So if you can read this problem, so this is about unbalance. The actual unbalance is in the planes B and C. You wish to add unbalances in the plane A and D. So A and D are like 0 and 4th plane. The 1 and 2 plane have got unbalances, and these unbalanced masses are 18 kg and 12.5 kg, each having an eccentricity of 6 centimeter. And it is decided that you need to add masses in the planes A and D at an eccentricity this time of 8 centimeter, and such that after the addition of these unbalanced masses A and D, the entire system should get balanced. So the angle between the masses B and C is known to be 100 degree, between B and A is known to be 190 degree, and the axial distance between A and B is 10 centimeter, and that between B and C is 20 centimeter. If the shaft is in complete dynamic balance, we need to determine the masses at A and D, we need to determine the axial distance between C and D, and we also need to determine the position of the mass, angular position of the mass at D. So I will give you a moment's time to think as to how to do this problem, and in the meantime you can have some interaction with me so that I can set you up for this problem. We'll make this as a tabular method of determining the counterbalances. So here is the tabular method. So the plane 0 in this case corresponds to the plane which is A, the plane 1 corresponds to the plane which is designated as B in the problem, plane 2 corresponds to the plane which is designated as C in the problem, and plane 3 is designated as D in the problem. So there are 4 planes, 0, 1, 2 and 3. So everything is known about plane 1 and plane 2. There is some data missing about plane A and plane D, which is what we need to find. Firstly, we can find out what are the masses in these planes, and if I am correct, then the masses that has to be put as per the definition of the problem is 8 and 8 in case of the planes A and D, and for the other plane for B and C it is 18 kg and 12.5 kg as per the problem statement. So let us go back therefore and put the masses as 18 kg and 5 kg. Oh sorry, the masses here are not given, right. This is 18 and 12.5. I am sorry, the masses at A and D were not given. So the masses B and C are given as 18 kg and 12.5 kg. The masses at A and B have an eccentricity of 8. So now we will tabulate the eccentricities also. So the eccentricity E, that's in centimeters, and this is in kgs. The eccentricity here is 8. The eccentricity in plane D is also 8. The masses here is unknown. MA is unknown at this stage. MD is also unknown at this stage. However, the eccentricity is known, right? And again, if I look back, the eccentricity at B and C is how much is that? 6 centimeters. So eccentricity at B and C is given as 6 centimeters. So let us write that down. This is 6 and this is 6. So therefore, the unbalance in each of this plane and this is nothing but M times E. So this is going to be 8 times MA this is going to be 8 times md for sure, and you will have 12.5 into 6, that is 72 plus 3, which is 75, and 18 times 6 will be 108. Okay, so these are the unbalanced in the planes A, B, C and D. Okay, so next, carrying on, we now need to determine we'll do the moment first and then we will do the, so this is the rotated moment, and we need to determine it along the two components Z and Y. So the rotated moment, before calculating the rotated moment, I should first determine the distance from the reference plane. So distance from the reference plane, I'll make another column for it. So I am choosing this as reference, the 0 plane as the reference plane. So therefore here everything is 0. Distance from A to B, I think, is given in the problem. So we'll turn back to the problem and see what is the distance from A and B. The distance from A and B is given as 10 centimeter. So therefore the distance from A to B, will mark that as 10. So this is also x, the symbol is x, and this distance is given in centimeter, right. Similarly, the distance from B to C, I suppose, was given. So B to C distance is 20 centimeter. So therefore the total distance between A to C will be 10 plus 20, which is 30. So therefore we'll put that down. So this is 30, and this distance is unknown. The distance at for the other unbalance at the plane counterbalance xd is unknown. Similarly, we will tabulate what are the angles that are given. So angle also we will tabulate. The angular orientation between, so if we put our reference for the angle as C as B, so you will recall the angle between masses B and C is said to be 100 degree, and that between B and A is said to be 190 degree. So we will pick up the reference for the angle to be that along B. So if I have to draw the picture corresponding to the angle, this is how it should look like. So let's say the angle, the mass B, this is MBEB. So as per the data of the problem, the angle between B and C is given. MCEC should be, I keep forgetting the data, the angle between B and C is 100 degree. Okay, so the angle between B and C is 100 degree. So this angle is 100 degree, and similarly the angle between B and A, I suppose, is 190 degree. So B and A is 190 degree. So if I go another 90 degrees, I will reach A. So this is A, another 90 degree. So therefore this is MAEA. So which means with reference to B, the angle is given. So the angle of B, I will call it as 0. The angle between B and C is 100 degree. Please remember, these are in degrees, not in radians. So you may have to convert these in radians at a later stage. Similarly, the angle at A is known to be 190 degree. At this stage, we don't know what is the angle theta D. This is an unknown at this stage. Okay, so this is the data that has been given. Now we will talk about the calculations. Firstly, we will do the rotated couple vector calculation. So these are the rotated couple. Firstly, we will find along Z direction, and secondly we will find along Y direction. Okay, so formula for this will be m times e times x into cos theta, and the formula for this would be m times e times x into sin theta, right? So for the first row it's very simple, because x is 0, again this is what I referred to as the first choice. Because x is 0, we have made a smart choice of choosing the reference plane to be aligned with one of the planes for which data are unknown. So on this plane, for example, MA was unknown, but we've been very smart in choosing the reference right here, so that there is no issue of couple on this plane, because the factor x is killing this problem, right? So the factor x being 0, both MEX cos theta as well as MEX sin theta is turning 0. Now let's turn to B. In B we need to find MEX cos theta, but theta is 0. So sin theta will be 0 again. This is also another smart choice. We are making as many zeros as we can, such that our calculations are reducing and simplifying. So therefore the only component which remains is MEX cos of 0, which is 1. So this is going to be 1080, right? And if you do the calculation now for the plane C, so this time you have to take 75 into 30 into cos of 100. Now cos of 100 degree will give you a negative value, and therefore this comes out as minus 392.44 when you do the calculations, okay. Similarly, when you do the calculations for the sine of 100 degree, sine of 100 degree is positive. So 75 into 30 into sine of 100 degree will give you 2215.51 as the result, okay. This one we don't know, so we will keep it as 8 md xd cos theta d and 8 md xd into sin theta d. We don't know at this stage what is md and what is xd and what is theta d. But what we know is that md and xd and theta d should be chosen in such a fashion that the sum total of this row. So if we now sum up each of these rows, this summation should give me a value which is 0. So this implies 8 md xd cos theta d plus 1080 minus 392 is going to be 687.56 roughly. That should be 0. And similarly 8 md xd sin theta d plus 2215.51 should be 0, right. So this implies 8 md xd cos theta d has got to be minus 687.56, and 8 md xd sin theta d has got to be minus 2215.51, okay. Now it is very easy from these two to determine the value of theta d. If you take the ratio, then I think I could go a little bit down, yeah. So from this two we can calculate tan theta d is going to be 2215.51 minus 687.51. Please realize both sin theta d and cos theta d is negative, which implies theta d should be in the third quadrant. So I'll make that remark as sin theta d and cos theta d are negative, theta d should be in the third quadrant. So therefore, theta d is tan inverse of this number, which comes out to be 3.22 around, and this will lead us. There are two solutions for tan inverse 3.22. One is 72 degree and one is 250 degree. So let us take these two solutions. One is 72.72 degrees and the other is 252.72 degrees. Okay. However, between the two solutions we cannot choose this, we would rather choose this because we have already inferred that theta d has to be in the third quadrant. The one which is corresponding to the third quadrant is this answer, which is theta d equals to 252. So the answer for the angular orientation of the counterbalance that has to be put in theta d in the d plane is going to be 252.72. Okay, this is the first answer. Similarly, again if I call this as equation 1, from equation 1 we can eliminate theta d, that is 8 md xd would be square of 687.56 square plus 2215.51 square. So therefore 8 md xd will come out as 2319.747, which implies md times xd is going to be 289.968. Okay. So that is another result that we could get. So the moment balance, therefore the moment balance, I am sorry, the moment balance could lead us to this stage wherein we have been able to get the angular orientation and we have been also able to get a quantity which is md xd, but we are not able to get md till this stage, we are only able to get xd. So we will see how we will resolve this situation. We can still play with one more very important quantity. So instead of theta d, I will erase this theta d and put this as 252.72 is what our solution gave us for theta d. So we will now go to the force vector, and the force vector will again be resolved into two components, one is along z and the other is along y. The force vector is as it is, so this is me cos theta and this is me sin theta, right. So then if you take the values of, let us say first we will start with the x1, the x is easy because the sin theta is 0, so sin theta will not bother us. So sin theta will give us a 0 here, and then we will get 108 as the value of the force. That should be easy. Unbalanced force is me, so me times cos theta, theta is 0, that is 108. Now 8 ma times cos 190, again cos 190 is going to be little over 180 degree, so that is going to give us a negative sign and this will work out to be minus 7.88 ma. Okay, cos of 190 is just little less than minus 1, so cos of 180 is minus 1, so cos of 190 will be nearly minus 1, so therefore instead of 8 ma you are going to get minus 7.8 ma, and on the sine side you will be getting minus 1.5 4 MA. Okay, and similarly this calculation ME times cos of 100 degree will give you again a negative number, and this is minus 13.08. Okay, everything about this one is known. So this is minus 13.08. The sine of 100 degree is going to be a positive number, and that's so ME times sine of 100 degree, ME times sine of 100 degree is working out to be 73.85. Okay, and lastly if we do for the last row, which is the corresponding to the plane D. So 8 MD times cos of 250 is working 252 is working out to be minus 2.457 MD. There is no issue about XD here because we are only multiplying MD with cos of 252. Theta D has been determined in the previous step, which is 252. Therefore, 8 MD times cos of 252. Calculations tell me that this is minus 2.457 MD. Similarly, 8 MD times sine of 252, calculations tell me that this is minus 7.613 MD. Okay. So now we have completed the table for the force as much as we could. Here again there are two unknowns, namely MA and MD. So but if we have to now again satisfy the equilibrium condition, the sum total of these columns, the sum of these columns and the sum of these the sum of these rows for this column and the sum of the rows for the column for the sin theta component, both these should sum up to 0. So sum of these columns should be 0, which essentially implies we are going to get few more equations. So that is going to be of this form. I have run out of space, so we will do it this way. Yeah, we will do it here. So minus 7.88 MA minus 2.457 MD is going to be, so this is minus 7.8 MA and this is minus 2.447 MD. I am going to take 108 and 13.8 on the other side. So this will come in with a change in sign. So this will be minus 108 plus 13.05 or 07, 13.08 roughly. So minus 13.08 will now become plus 13.08, and this is roughly 94.98 or something like that. Okay. Similarly, if you do the summation for this last column, minus 1.4 MA and minus 7.613 MD is what you get on the left hand side of your equation. So minus 1.4 MA minus 7.613 MD, that should come out as, there is only 73.85 positive. So if I take it on the other side of the equality, it will come out as minus 73.85. Now this is these are the two equations in two variables, namely MA and MD. So you can solve them out and the answer comes out as MA is 9.57 kg and MD as 7.93 kg. Okay. And finally, we also need to find XD, but we have already found out MD times XD is 289. So as MD times XD is 289 already found out, and we have by now found out MD, so therefore we can take XD is 289.96 68 or 97, whatever you think, divided by 7.93, and this calculation is going to give whatever is the value of xt. Okay. So that completes the calculation. We have determined all the unknowns. MA, MD, which were unknown, has been determined. XD also has been determined. So everything has been determined at this stage, and therefore we have completed the calculation process. Okay. I'll take a pause and wait for your questions if you have any regarding this solution process.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Good
hello.
morning.
Good morning.
Why reciprocity engine is not fully balanced, sir? Any reason?
What is that? Come here,
Why
question.
reciprocity engine is not fully balanced, sir? Any reason?
We are talking about rotating rotary unbalances now. We will talk about reciprocating engines also. So please ask questions in the context. So at this time we are talking about rotating balance, and I would appreciate if you keep your doubts within that. I will talk about reciprocating engines in due course.
Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. CEC Gurpreet, you are saying that the entire table is not visible. I'm sorry, this is the best the technology can offer. I will make sure that it will be visible to you in the PDF file, but at present it is visible to us, and possibly it's visible to the other participants also. Looks like you are having a technical issue. I'm afraid at this point there is nothing which can be done, but this PDF file will be posted in your course pack. Please take a look at the PDF file to resolve your doubt. Okay, we'll move on to GGP IGB. As you take mass A as a reference plane, is it possible to take mass B also? It is, there's nothing wrong. GGP IGB, your question is why didn't we take the reference plane as B? You could take the reference plane as B, but in that case your calculations will be more difficult. That's the only thing. So if you think carefully, the reason why we took our reference plane at A was because we did not know something about A. We did not know the mass at A. So therefore, it is always a smarter choice to put your reference plane coinciding with exactly one of the planes for which data is unknown, because in so doing the moments associated with that unbalances will not get reflected in the calculation. If you take any other arbitrary plane, then the calculations will be more I would say more clumsy and more tedious. So that will lead to larger number of equations which are solvable. There is nothing wrong about that, but it will be just more tedious. So therefore, as I keep saying, the smarter choice is to choose the reference plane coinciding with some plane wherein the data is unknown, because in so doing, as you see here, you are getting the couple values to be 0 along those planes for which the data is unknown. So therefore, when you solve the moment equations, you will be able to readily get some new information. Some of these values will be obtainable, whereas if you had chosen an arbitrary value of an arbitrary plane as the reference plane, then the zeros would not have come, and if the zeros would not have come, things would have been very difficult to solve the equation. But now that this problem is solved, please repeat it if you want to in about other reference plane, and you will be convinced that the calculation is more tedious, more lengthy if you would have chosen another reference plane. So that choice is just based on experience, that you make the choice of reference plane to be coinciding with those planes for which the data is not given, it is unknown, it is supposed to be calculated, right. So keep that in mind. I hope you will find my answer satisfactory. PSGCT is asking, instead of adding masses, is it possible to remove masses? Yes, definitely you can remove masses from the other side. Just remember that you don't add mass in the same side as you have removed masses. So addition of mass in one side could be easily construed as removal of mass from the other side, but there is a problem in that case. When we are adding masses, these are point masses. We are saying that these are point masses. If you simply take a drill and put a hole which is equivalent to this mass on the disc, then that hole may be actually a very big hole, and then things become a little problematic. But in principle you are right, you can remove mass from the other side, but in practice the problem will be that if you have a disc and instead of adding a point mass, you will be removing an area, right. So this issue will cause a problem. So that is again a practical problem, because of which actually this suggestion is not feasible in reality. In practice, we will always try to add mass rather than remove mass, because removing masses will actually tamper with the design. You don't want to tamper with the design. Suppose this is like a grinding wheel and or a turbine blade, you don't want to suddenly put a drill and remove some masses from your turbo machinery application. That will be not allowable. So more often than not, in practical cases, this suggestion is not workable, though theoretically it is fine to remove masses, but the removal of masses will not be accomplished in a manner in which you can add a mass to a point. Point masses can be added, but removal of point mass is just very difficult to implement in practice. So that's why the suggestion probably is not workable, though theoretically it is actually an acceptable suggestion. We'll move on to the next question. Is it compulsory that from SSETN, I suppose, is it compulsory that the unknown plane has to be taken the reference plane? I think I just clarified this question for the other participant also, but I repeat myself. There is nothing compulsory that you have to take reference plane here or there, but you should save yourself from doing laborious calculations. So therefore, my suggestion is choose the reference plane coinciding with one plane wherein you don't know something. If you know everything about that plane, please don't choose that as a reference plane, because that will not give you any additional benefit in terms of the calculation procedure. In principle, you are correct. That's why I ask you as a homework, please repeat this problem by, let's say, choosing the reference plane at B, and you would come back to me saying that definitely that choice of reference plane leads to much more calculation. So the calculation will be time consuming and tedious. To save yourself from that, my suggestion is choose the reference plane to be coinciding with some plane for which the data is not given, because in so doing you will be able to get zeros associated with those planes where data is not given, and therefore things will be nice and simple for you. CEC is asking me about the graphical method to solve the same problem. The graphical method is just about drawing those uh, force vectors and moment vectors. It is given in any textbook, but the reason why I omitted graphical methods as opposed to I emphasize the analytical method, because the analytical method is actually implementable in a computational program. Graphical method is difficult to implement in a computational program, and I believe the world today is moving towards analytical methods and computational methods as opposed to graphical methods. But yes, the graphical methods is just the same, where you draw force vectors and rotated moment vectors and try to close that vector diagram. Essentially the same idea, but within the time that we are having, I thought this is the best I could present, and between the two methods I always favor analytical methods as opposed to graphical methods. Please, you are encouraged to read about graphical methods in any book. I have referred to Ghosh and Mallik's book, so it does carry the solution in graphical methods also. Even in graphical methods, when I teach kinematics and dynamics of machinery, I always favor doing these graphical solutions in an AutoCAD environment. So I would also recommend that instead of doing it on pen and paper, please do it in computer graphics and AutoCAD or Pro E or whatever you have, because that's, I think, what the world is changing to. Okay, so we'll take another question from GGIPGB. Would you explain the concept of drawing couple and force diagram for the same question? I think the answer is again just the same. The force diagram and couple diagram can be drawn, but I just wish to limit myself in the analytical method because we will run short of time. As I gave in the syllabus, I will limit myself to analytical methods. That's partly because I think analytical methods are better suited for computer implementation, and the world today is moving towards computer implementation, and that's the message I want to drive home. But graphical methods are the traditional classical methods in designing, so no way it is less important, but within 5 hours time I thought this is the best I could offer. So I will limit myself to analytical methods only. I will encourage you to read about it from Ghosh and Mallik's book or any book for that matter. They all most books will have a treatment in graphical methods also. Let's now with this we are finishing our discussion on rotating machines. We will now move on to reciprocating machines, and as we said, we will talk about reciprocating machine strictly from the context of the internal combustion engine. This is again a very important machine that all of us should worry about. So amidst all these details of the internal combustion engine that we see, we must identify what are the moving parts and what are the stationary parts. So if you realize, I have boxed in some put a red box around certain parts, these are the moving parts, and for your reference I will just name them one after the other. So first is the piston. The piston is one which has the reciprocating motion. It is a moving part. Then there is a connecting rod which is having some kind of motion which I will describe. The cylinder does not have any motion, the crankcase that is, and this is the crankshaft. I have forgotten to put a red box around it, but this also has motion. There are other moving parts like this gear and other things, but at present we will concentrate only in these moving parts. In fact, this gear will have identical motion as the crankshaft. There is another gear here which is supposedly driving this cam to make this valve open. So there are lots of other details in the engine, but I will concentrate towards these four parts. One is the cylinder, the other is the piston, this other is the connecting rod, and the crankcase. Okay. So there are lots of other components which we won't talk about, but please understand that there is some interconnection between these moving parts. For example, the piston is moving in a reciprocating fashion. The piston is sliding through a hole of the cylinder. So this is a specific kind of interconnection, and in the language of kinematics we call this as a sliding pair. So each interconnection is only going to allow a certain kind of relative motion between the interconnected parts. So if we look at it carefully, between the frame and the crankcase, as you see here, this is some kind of bearing. So the crankshaft is going to rotate about the crankcase or the cylinder with through this interconnection of the bearing. So there is a bearing which allows this crankshaft to rotate. So that interconnection in the language of kinematics is called revolute joint. So revolute joint is that which allows rotary motion. Sliding pair is one which allows translatory motion. So similarly, now if we shift our attention to connecting rod, this connecting rod on one end is attached to a piston and on the other end is attached to the crank, right. But you should not worry it when you are thinking about interconnections. Please forget everything else. All other links you can throw out of your memory. Please understand that when we are talking about interconnection between piston and this connecting rod, you should not worry about the crank and the crankcase. Okay. So let us say that the piston is held fixed. So what is the relative motion between the piston and the connecting rod? If the piston is held fixed, you will be able to understand that it is only undergoing rotation and nothing else, right. So therefore there is again a relative motion between the piston and the connecting rod, and that relative motion is again a pure rotation. But while seeing from the ground, we do not see connecting rod to be just rotating. The reason we do not see will be obvious to you in a moment, but please mark my words, it is the relative motion between the piston and connecting rod which is going to be rotary. The observed motion, we are all standing on the frame which is stationary. The observed motion of the connecting rod is not going to be rotary, but the relative motion between the piston and the connecting rod, that is, if you hold the piston fixed, the connecting rod is simply going to undergo a rotary motion. Similarly, if you hold the crank fixed, the connecting rod is going to rotate about the crank. So therefore we say that the crank is attached to the connecting rod through a revolute joint, and similarly the connecting rod is attached to the piston also through a revolute joint. So I will at this stage show you an animation to make myself clear. So these are the green block is the piston, the blue block here is the connecting rod, and the blue line, the other one, is the crank. So between the crank and the stationary frame, this black circle denotes a revolute joint. Similarly, there is a revolute joint which is not shown here between the connecting rod and the crankcase. So there is a revolute joint here, and there is also a revolute joint between the connecting rod and the piston. So these revolute joints on either side of the connecting rod allow only rotational motion between the connecting rod and the piston, or between the connecting rod and the crank. But please remember, both the crank as well as the piston are moving. The crank is moving rotationally with respect to the frame, and similarly the piston is moving in a translatory fashion with respect to the frame. So therefore, the observed motion, though it is rotational with respect the observed motion of the connecting rod, though it is rotational with respect to the crank and rotational with respect to the piston, it is not going to be observed as rotational motion with respect to the frame, because both the piston as well as the connecting rod are having some sort of motion. So that is what complicates the motion of the connecting rod. We will discuss in exorbitant details as to how to arrive at these types of motion. But at this point I want you to realize that the kinematic diagram of this very important machine, namely the IC engine, is going to be containing these four components, namely the crankcase, which is the stationary member which is not moving, the crank itself which is having rotational motion with respect to the stationary member, the piston which is having translatory motion with respect to the stationary member, and the connecting rod which is having rotary motion both with respect to the piston as well as with respect to the crank, but it is not rotary motion with respect to the frame. Okay, but the interconnections are therefore revolute between the crank and the crankcase, revolute between the crank and the connecting rod, and revolute between the connecting rod and the piston, but between the piston and the crank it is going to be a sliding pair. So I'll make a note of that in my notepad. So I'll go to my tablet and I'll make a note for that. So you will have the members are as follows: the crank case or the frame and the crank itself, and they will be connected by a revolute joint which I am just abbreviating as R. Okay, the crank and the connecting rod will have only rotary motion. The relative motion between the crank and the connecting rod is only rotary and nothing else. So if you hold the crank fixed, the connecting rod can only rotate about the crank, right. So this is again going to be a revolute joint, and similarly the connecting rod and the piston is also going to have only a relative rotational motion and nothing else. So this is also going to be a revolute joint, but the last one between the piston and the frame, the piston will not have rotary motion with respect to the frame, but it will have only a sliding motion, and that is why we will call this as a P pair. So P is called prismatic or sliding pair. Okay. So therefore these three objects, that is the frame, if I can draw this in a diagram in this fashion, the frame, the crank is connected by a revolute joint, the crank and the con rod is connected by another revolute joint, the con rod and the piston is connected by another revolute joint, but the piston is connected to the frame with a prismatic pair. Okay. So this is what we call as a closed kinematic chain. Okay. So all these moving parts are forming a closed kinematic chain. There are four objects which is relevant to our study for the kinematics and dynamics of engines, and these are frame, crank, the con rod and the piston, and the interconnections are as given in this diagram. But you will note that every part is interconnected to two other parts, and therefore it forms a closed kinematic chain. And the interconnections, now we realize very easily that there are three revolute joints and one prismatic joint. So therefore we will call this as a 3RP kinematic chain. So this IC engine in the language of mechanism is a very good example of 3RP or the slider crank mechanism. There are many more examples, but let's stick to this example to be specific. Okay. So, this is just a refreshing of the kinematics of mechanisms of the mechanism that we are going to study. The important thing which is not dealt with in kinematics, but this is what we will try to concentrate here, is about the forces and torques. So, dynamics of machines, as you know, as opposed to kinematics, we are here bothered more about the forces and torques. So, we wish to understand what are the forces and torques which are getting transmitted due to these interconnections. So, if you have one body interconnected to the other, there will be some forces and some torques as an action reaction pair which will get transmitted between these two bodies which are interconnected. That is what we are going to determine through this analysis. But before we go to the dynamics, as we said, we will refresh our memory for the kinematics part of it, and that is what we are going to do very quickly. So, you will recall that the reason why we do not worry about the actual construction of the engine is because the exact geometry of this rigid body is irrelevant for the study of kinematics. It may be relevant for many other purposes of practical importance, but as far as the kinematics of this problem goes, it is not relevant, for example, to know what is the thickness of this crankcase. It is not relevant to know what is the material of the conrod. It is not relevant to know how many liners are there in the piston. These may be very important parameters in the total design of your engine, but as far as the kinematics of this engine goes, these are not relevant, and therefore we wish to filter out all these irrelevant information and carefully look at only the things which are relevant. So, therefore, we can draw a skeleton diagram in that form. What we need is the position of each revolute joint as the members are moving. So, this is amply described through what we call as a kinematic diagram. So, in kinematic diagram, it is the kinematic dimensions and interconnection alone which find a place. Every other detail is sort of erased, and we carefully consider only that details which are relevant to our kinematic study. Every other details, like for example, what is the color of your engine, that is irrelevant for the kinematic study. If there is any friction, that is irrelevant for the kinematic study. So, therefore, we do not wish to consider anything which is irrelevant as far as the kinematics is concerned. But yet this description is entirely and totally complete, because if you know what is happening at, let us say, the midpoint of this line, then you should be able to say that though the actual crank may look something different, may look like a disc, you should be able to find the kinematics of all other points on that disc. Okay. So, please do not think that this is some sort of an approximation or simplification because we do not know how to handle the real geometry, that is why we are taking a skeleton geometry of this sort. Nothing like that. We know how to handle the exact geometry, but we do not wish to take in any further complications. We need to take only those complications which are relevant. Once you know what is the rotational speed of this line, you can find the velocity of any point of the actual member of the crankcase. Definitely the crankcase does not look like a line, it has so many webs and other things, but whichever point of your crankcase is of interest to you, the motion of any point of your crankcase can be determined once you know the exact characteristics of motion of this line, right. So, what I have indicated to you here is the kinematic diagram of the actual IC engine that looks very complicated. Kinematic diagram is fairly simple. So, I have indicated by different colors the different bodies, and these circles are the revolute joint, and this is how we indicate a sliding pair, okay, with dotted lines. So, this indicates that the piston, which is shown in blue, is actually having a sliding motion with respect to the frame. The connecting rod kinematic line diagram is shown in red, and a black circle, if you note, denotes that the connecting rod is connected with the piston through a revolute joint. Similarly, the connecting rod is connected with the crank, which is shown in magenta over here, or purple I would say. The connecting rod in red is connected with the crank in the drawn in purple through a revolute joint, and the crank in turn is connected with the frame through a revolute joint. So, the description which I drew in the form of chain diagram is carried forward in this kinematic diagram also. So, kinematic dimensions and connections alone are represented, and IC engine, as I said, is an example of a slider crank mechanism. There are many more. So I would like to talk mostly about this IC engine mechanism. So again, to repeat myself, crank is undergoing rotation, the slider is undergoing a translatory motion up and down, so therefore we call it reciprocation, but connecting rod is undergoing both rotation as well as reciprocation. So let us say it is rotating with respect to the piston, but the piston or the slider is itself having some translatory motion. So therefore the total motion of the connecting rod is the addition of the relative motion as observed by the observer seated on the piston plus the motion of the piston itself. The motion of the piston is that of translation, and the relative motion as observed from the piston is that of rotation. Therefore you will be convinced that the total motion of the connecting rod as observed by a stationary observer sitting on the frame is going to be a combination of rotation as well as reciprocation, and this is what makes the analysis a little more complicated, but we will handle it, no issues. So let us again refresh our memory that how do we do the kinematics for this purpose. So a simple calculation shows that this is a 1 degree of freedom mechanism, which means if you know the position of any one member in this kinematic chain, the position of any other member is very easily determined. So we will just recapitulate how that is done. So here theta denotes the crank angle, that is the angle between the crank and the line of reciprocation of the piston. So this is denoted by theta, and x denotes the position. So we have put our origin exactly at the revolute joint which connects the crank with the frame, and from here we try to measure the distance of the piston. So x is for us r cos theta plus L cos phi. Phi is this angle which is the angle between the direction of x and the connecting rod. Theta is the angle between the direction of the crank and the direction of the slider motion. So by trigonometry it is fairly clear that x, the total distance here, is r cos theta. R cos theta is the component of r along x, and L cos phi is the component of L along x. If you add these two, you will get x. Also from trigonometry it is very clear the sine component of r and L should be same. So r sin theta should be equal to L sin phi. So we have two very important relationship which is coming from good old trigonometry, that is r sin theta is equals to L sin phi, and the slider position itself is given as r cos theta plus L cos phi. From the first relation, that is r sin theta equals to L sin phi, you could now given theta find out phi. So phi is determined if theta is known. If theta is known, you put in the value of the kinematic dimensions r and L, sine inverse 1 by lambda sine theta is going to give you phi. So that is again a fairly easy calculation. If you know what is theta, if you know the kinematic dimensions, you should know the kinematic dimensions of your IC engine because that is given to you. So you will determine what is r, you will determine what is L, and these do not change over time also. So everything is nice and fine here. So the only thing which is changing in with time in this relation is theta. So at every time instant, if you have some way of finding out what is the orientation of your crankcase, then you can as well find out this angle, that is the orientation of the connecting rod with respect to the direction of slider motion. So the slider position itself is r cos theta plus L cos phi, but we now know that phi is a function of theta. So r is a constant, L is a constant, phi is a function of theta. So therefore this essentially means x is a function of theta. So therefore just like a 1 degree of freedom mechanism should enable us to do, we are actually finding out the position of each and every member of this 1 degree of freedom mechanism simply with one variable, that is if the crank alignment is known to us, we should be able to find out the piston position, we should be able to know the alignment of the connecting rod also. So the connecting rod alignment is given by this phi, whereas the slider position is given by this x, and we now see it in this form that since phi is also a function of theta, we are going to see that r cos theta plus L cos phi is essentially a function of theta. So this is what determines the position of the slider in terms of the crank angle. Now if you have to find the velocity, you just need to differentiate this, and while doing this we have to remember that we have to take theta dot. So f as a function of theta, you differentiate with respect to theta and then you put theta dot. So dx dt is df d theta into d theta dt. So that is again a age old rule of calculus, we are not going to spend much time on this. But now if we assume that the crank is moving at a constant speed, again that is why I took the example of IC engine. This may not be so for all slider crank mechanisms, but when you are talking mostly about IC engine which is moving at constant speed, usually we will take that this theta the theta dot or the omega, the angular velocity, is constant. So therefore you can take derivative once more, and that derivative will just give you f double dot theta plus theta dot square. Had this not been moving with a constant speed, but there had been an acceleration, then there would have been another term which is coming. But as I said, I will concentrate mostly from the perspective of IC engine. So in IC engines, it is possibly a good assumption that you are going to make the analysis for a fixed speed, right. So I am going to make the analysis at this point for a fixed speed, and that enables me to find the slider position as a function of crank angle, find the slider velocity as a function of crank velocity, find slider acceleration as a function of crank velocity. Again, the crank acceleration is just 0 by my assumption that I am interested for due to practical consideration in a situation where my crank is moving at the constant speed. Okay, so if I now make this try and plot out these results, and this is what I will emphasize. Please don't worry about the formula. What is more important is to get a feel of the results. So what I have done is, instead of showing you these formulas of f prime theta and f double prime theta, whatever they may be, I have actually plotted the results. Okay, so this is the plot of x by r with respect to theta. Crank angle theta is the x axis. So this is how the displacement of the slider goes. Similarly, I have plotted v by r omega, the velocity of the piston divided by r times omega as a function of crank angle, and this is how it goes. And similarly, I have plotted the acceleration of the slider divided by, let us say, the centripetal acceleration kind of term, r omega square, and there as a function of theta. Please try to visualize these three plots. What is immediately obvious to us is that these functions are periodic. These functions are just very periodic. If you observe, the periodicity is roughly here, which is little over 6, and if you make if you put a finer scale, you should be able to say that this is actually 6.28, and that makes sense because all our expressions are trigonometric, and therefore all the sin theta, cos theta or its derivative will bring in periodicities which will repeat with 2 pi. So therefore you get to see repetitions of the kinematics at every 2 pi, and that makes physical sense also, because if you look at this diagram is going to be just the same if it is repeated by 2 pi. So the diagram of position is obviously the same as it is repeated by 2 pi. The velocity is also, the physically if you try to interpret, there is absolutely no difference if I start the engine and for some reason you are coming in late into this demonstration, and you have come at a point where I have actually passed the entire one cycle. You will not be able to make any difference because everything seems to be repeating after a 2 pi. So once the clock goes the full cycle, everything about the clock is going to be just the same. So this is observed here, that the displacement, velocity and acceleration all are periodic. That is the first observation. But please note, whereas the displacement looks fairly like a sine, a single sine, the velocities and acceleration doesn't look like a single sinusoid. It looks like more complicated than a single sinusoid. This we will try and unravel as we go along, but at this point we make an observation that the displacement looks like a harmonic function, whereas the velocity and the acceleration looks like a more complicated function than a harmonic function. Why it happens, we will soon find out. So this is an exact kinematic analysis. There is absolutely nothing that is approximated in this analysis. Everything is exact about it. But as I said, the expression here is actually too cumbersome to write it, and I don't find any need to write it also. But you may find out that by doing the derivation yourself, that the expression is actually little complicated to even memorize, and why should we care to memorize. So therefore, instead of doing an exact kinematics, we will now do an approximate kinematics, and the place where we will bring about this approximation is the following. We had already unearthed this equation where we had said r sin theta is equals to L sin phi, and if you take r by L as lambda, then you will get sin phi is equals to lambda times sin theta. So, we will start with that expression sin phi equals to lambda times sin theta. And now we come at a very crucial practical observation. In practice, it is mostly seen that this lambda fellow, lambda which is defined as r by L, and if you recollect, r is the dimension, kinematic dimension of the crankcase, and L is the kinematic dimension of the connecting rod. In most practical IC engines, you will find r by L is small. R by L is of the order of 1 by 3 and 1 by 4 in most practical IC engines. This is not true for a general slider crank mechanism. You could have a punching press, you could have a sawing machine, all of these are slider crank mechanisms, but there may be places where lambda is not small. But as I said, we are going to limit ourselves to the discussion of IC engines, and in IC engines it is very fair to assume that lambda is small, and therefore when we make this assumption in the x by r formula, remember if I again go back a few slides, I had determined x as r cos theta plus L cos phi. So again if I pull out r, I will be able to get r times cos theta plus 1 by lambda times cos phi. So this is exactly where I start from here. So x by r is cos theta plus cos phi divided by lambda. Now cos phi can be written in terms of 1 minus sin square phi square root of it, but sin square phi fortunately can be written as lambda square sin square theta and square root of it to the power half. So this x by r statement is exact. At this point everything is exact about the analysis, but now we are introducing the approximation. We can split this into a binomial series expansion provided we know for sure that this term is small. So it fortunately for us, we realize that in practice, in practical IC engines, we will have this lambda value to be small, and therefore we can take a binomial series approximation for this. And when you take the binomial series approximation, it simply boils down to lambda square by 2 sin square theta plus other terms. We will actually not care about too many terms in this binomial series because we have already made the assumption that lambda is small. So if lambda is small, lambda square is even smaller. The next term which will involve lambda cube will be even smaller, lambda 4 even smaller. So higher order terms will not be so relevant. So the first term in this expression is definitely going to be lambda square by 2, and that is all we will care about at this point. So therefore x by r at this stage we will make lambda square sin square theta whole to the power half when you make this substitution, and then when you resolve sin square theta as 1 minus cos 2 theta by 2, this is what the expression will look like. So x by r will be this plus cos theta plus lambda by 4 cos 2 theta. So again you realize x by r, which is the displacement plot that you had seen in this slide. So this displacement plot will have a constant value, will have something which is depending exactly like a cosine in as a function of theta plus lambda by 4 times cos 2 theta. But you already know that lambda is small, and this plot, if you have observed carefully, has been taken for lambda equals to 1 by 3. So therefore the contribution from cosine 2 theta, the amplitude is actually 1 by 12. So in the plot that you have seen, you have cos theta plus 1 by 12 cos 2 theta. So therefore cos 2 theta component is hardly visible in this plot. You are almost seeing this as a cos theta component. The nature of it is cosine because at 0 you have an amplitude. But please observe that the mean value of this curve doesn't settle at 0, and obviously it should not. That is because you have a mean value sitting here. So this is the mean value of which is shown in that plot. But now it is fairly easy to do the differentiation. When we do the differentiation once, this term is not going to bother us because this is constant. Cos theta will give us a minus sin theta, and cos 2 theta will give us a minus 2 times sin 2 theta, that will get multiplied with lambda by 4, and you will have lambda by 2 sin 2 theta. So therefore at this stage what we see that the velocity, just like the acceleration, sorry, just like the expression for x, the expression for velocity also has two terms. Last time it was cos and cos theta and cos 2 theta. This time we have sin theta and sin 2 theta. But this time the contribution of sin 2 theta is more. So you have lambda by 2 sitting here, whereas you had lambda by 4 sitting in the expression for position. So therefore it is expected that the average value of V will be 0, which is what you had seen in this plot. The average value of V is 0, and it is also expected that this will now start showing him some characteristics which will make it different from a pure sin theta or cosine theta plot. So that was also observed here. Whereas this looked like a cosine plot, this had showed a reasonable deviation with the sine plot, simply because you now have a 1 by 3 component of the second harmonic sitting in your expression. So this term is now reasonably dominant, such that you can get to see that this plot of V no longer looks like a simple harmonic plot, but it is actually looking like a double harmonic. Similarly, you can have an acceleration plot or acceleration expression simply by differentiating once more. Sin theta will give you cos theta, sin 2 theta will give you cos 2 theta with a 2. So therefore this lambda by 2 now becomes 2. So in the expression for acceleration, you get to see the expression, the second component is even more dominant. So starting with position, it was lambda by 4. In velocity, it was lambda by 2. Now it is lambda. So therefore we found that the acceleration plot is therefore sufficiently far off from a cosine plot or a sine plot. So that was the observation, and this is how we can explain it. So from here on, this will be referred to as first order. What do we mean by order? Order means something which is theta itself is omega t. So this is changing like the speed. Theta is the angular variable. If you remember, theta is the angular variable. So the way theta changes if the crank is moving at a constant speed is theta equals to omega t. So theta equals to omega t is always the function for theta that we are going to take, and therefore these expressions will denote cos omega t, cos 2 omega t, sin omega t, sin 2 omega t, again cos and sin. So whenever we get to see cos omega t type of functions, we will call them as first order. Whenever we get to see cos 2 omega t or sin 2 omega t type of functions, we will get to say will refer to them as second order. Similarly, if we have third, if you get to see sin 3 theta, we will call them as third order, and so on and so forth. So when you say it, when you talk about orders, please remember that the function that we are talking about is either sine or a cosine, but the argument of that function could either be omega t, in which case it is first order, it could be n omega t, in which case it is of the nth order. So that is the definition of order for you. It is definitely a harmonic, each order is a harmonic, but the nth order is like the nth harmonic. It is n times omega t, which is nth order. So that's something that we are seeing in the kinematics also. So all the kinematic quantities, namely the position, the velocity and acceleration, are now expressed in terms of the engine order, because we know the engine is moving at a certain omega, at a certain velocity, angular velocity omega. The position, the velocity and the accelerations are all derived in terms of sinusoids and cosinusoids, which are dependent on this omega t. Either you have cos omega t, sin omega t sitting as it is, or you have multiples of this in terms of cos 2 omega t, sin 2 omega t, sin 3 omega t, whatever. Remember here, due to the binomial approximation, we have just taken the first term of it. If you take other terms, it will show up the third order, fourth order and whatnot. But as we said that since lambda is small, there is no need to go beyond the first order approximation, and this is just the first order approximation. If you just want to do a more accurate analysis by considering a by another term in this binomial expression, you can see how it looks like. It will be fairly similar, but they will bring in the third orders and fourth orders, as I said. Okay, so now that we have done exact analysis and approximate analysis, it is worth comparing how much is the difference, because the approximation that we have done is lambda equals to small, and we have killed terms beyond the first term in the binomial expansion. So I go back again and plot the two expressions for lambda equals to 1 by 3. You will it is plotted such that the exact solution is in blue solid line and the approximate solution is in red dots. It is one on top of the other. There is absolutely no mismatch between the exact and the approximate analysis. It is very accurate. So there is nothing lost in terms of the final result even if we do an approximate analysis. So the fun in the approximate analysis is now that these x by r, v by r, omega and a by r omega's formula are really compact and simple ones. I would not say please memorize these formulas, but it is still very compact and therefore it is very easy to work with these formulas rather than the full-fledged formulas which I was reluctant to even show you in its in its blown up form, in its expanded form. So therefore I will actually, once I have shown you that the approximate analysis is as good as the exact analysis, I will therefore use the approximate analysis even in the dynamics to actually make further derivations, and that was the purpose of showing the approximate analysis. To any interaction and questions. Okay, for CSE, SSE how the exact analysis is useful in practical application. Exact analysis gives a more simplified formula, and that's why it is useful. Anything which is simple and doesn't lose accuracy is very useful. That's what we will do. CEC Gurpreet, how is it important for in the balancing point of view? It is important in the balancing point of view. From the dynamics, we have still doing the kinematics. You will have to bear with me till we come to the dynamics. How to approach approximate kinematics for applications other than IC engines. If you have lambda to be small in other applications, you can use this approximation. If you don't have this, you cannot use it. You have to go for the exact approximation, exact analysis, as simple as that. Okay, I'll take one more question. From GHRC, how was the equation of acceleration of a second order one? So the equation for acceleration as also for the velocity leaves a cos 2 theta term. Cos 2 theta means it's a second order. So because we are taking position, the functional expression for position has both first order and second order. As I said, anything which has dependence of the type cos theta or sin theta is first order. Anything which has dependence of the form cos 2 theta or sin 2 theta is second order. So if you have a positional dependence where you take the cos 2 theta, this cos 2 theta is coming because there is a sin square theta. Sin square theta, when you break it down in trigonometry, you will get a cos 2 theta. Now velocities are obtained by simply differentiation, acceleration is obtained by a double differentiation. So the cos 2 theta term stays. When you take the double derivative of this expression, the cos 2 theta term will stay in the acceleration, and therefore the acceleration will have a cos 2 theta term, and this cos 2 theta term is the second order that I was referring to. So let's see what would be the objective of our talk, at least for the next class. So we will take what is known as the inverse kinematics approach. In the inverse kinematics approach, the following is the assumption. We know the position, velocity and acceleration of the mechanism, simply because what we are saying is that we know that the engine is running at a constant speed. The speed of the engine is constant, let's say 1000 rpm or whatever. That allows me to determine the position through an integration, that allows me to determine the acceleration, right. So if we know the position and the acceleration, if we know the velocity of the crankcase, we know the position of the crankcase, we know the, sorry, not the crankcase, the crank. If we know the velocity of the crank, we know the position of the crank, we also know the acceleration of the crank, either by differentiation or by integration. Acceleration this time we'll take it as 0 because it is a uniform rotary motion of the crank which we are considering. But now what we have shown through both exact and approximate analysis is once the crank motion is determined, the slider motion is also completely determined. So therefore for any point in the mechanism, position, velocity and acceleration is determined by the kinematics. So we would have solved the kinematics by this stage, and then this determination was done only through the kinematic dimensions. There is nothing about mass or inertial properties that we used in this analysis. But now as we cross the bridge and go towards the region of dynamics, we will use the mass properties. So now we will try to find out the forces which are required to cause this motion. So instead of saying that given a force find the motion, which is typically what engineering mechanics will try and solve, that you know what is the force, try and solve the acceleration, and once you get the acceleration, try and solve the velocity, try and find the position. But here it is the other way around. Now we know what is the position, velocity, acceleration for our mechanism. We are going to determine what are the forces such that this motion was possible. So this is what we call the inverse kinematics approach. So towards this end, we will need the inertia properties, and I will show you how. From geometry of every part, we will determine the mass. By inertia properties, we don't just mean that just take the mass in a spring balance and that's it. We will determine the mass, we will need the center of mass location, we will also need the moment of inertia about any point, but preferably about the center of mass. So what we need to do dynamic analysis in addition to the kinematic inputs is the inertial properties, and by inertial properties we need to know the value of the mass, the location of the center of mass, and the moment of inertia, preferably about a center of mass location. If it is about some other point, we can always use one of those moment of inertia theorems to translate this moment of inertia. So we will need the moment of inertia basically about the center of mass if it is available. If it is available for any other origin, that is also fine, we can shift it. So formulate the equations, we will be formulating the equations of motion of each part, including the applied and reactive forces at each and every joint. So again, this is why I said the prerequisite for this talk would be engineering mechanics. So in engineering mechanics, we were dealing with one body. Now we will be dealing with four different kind, or rather three different bodies, namely the crank, the connecting rod, and the piston. So we will for each of these bodies draw free body diagrams and derive equilibrium equations for each of these body. And when we set this complete thing up, that will give us the dynamics of the entire mechanism. Remember, mechanism is nothing but a collection of bodies. If you know how to do the equilibrium equation of a single body for a mechanism or for a machine, all that you have to realize is that the machine is comprising number of moving parts. You have to appeal to this same set of equations, the same equilibrium equations time and again, and thus arrive at the governing equations of motion for each and every moving part. And when you assemble this nicely in a matrix form, that is the equation of motion of your mechanism. So that's exactly what we are going to do, if not today, maybe tomorrow. The next class, I'm sorry, next class is not tomorrow. So the objective will be firstly to set up these kinds of equations of motion, and again it is nothing very fancy, it is nothing that, it's not rocket science to find out those equations of motion. It is simply appealing to the equilibrium conditions and the free body diagram for each and every moving part, and we will write down for each and every moving part the equilibrium equations, and then we will assemble it in a nice form. We will keep track as to what are the knowns and what are the unknowns, and we will determine, see, the objective as I said was that if you know that the kinematics is such and such, the objective will be to determine the forces and the moments which causes this motion. Okay, so we will determine the applied forces and moments which cause this motion. We will also like to determine the reaction forces between the joints. That's also very important, because you don't want the joints to fail, because if it fails, then the engine will just not be working. So therefore these reaction forces have to be endured by each and every bearing. So reaction force calculation is also important in that perspective. So after we set up the equation, we will see that the equation is just a solution of equations kind of thing, and this solution of equations, once it is accomplished, it will give us both the applied forces as well as the reaction forces which are acting at each and every joint. Unfortunately, the equations of the equations that we will find out will be something like, there will be 8 equations available and there will be 8 unknowns. So there is no point in trying to solve that problem in pen and paper through a hand calculation, but it is not a difficult problem to solve it on a computer. It is just a set of linear equations. You can write it in the form of Ax equals to B, and again I will encourage you to go to some scientific computation software such as MATLAB or maybe Mathematica, write these equations up in a scientific computation software, and they will have routines to actually solve them for you. So there is no point in trying to solve an equation of a system of 8 equations in 8 unknowns and trying to get some formula which may run over to several, but it's a routine calculation if you employ some scientific computational software such as MATLAB. So unfortunately the MATLAB part of it I will not be talking about, but I will leave you with that sort of assignment. Maybe in your summer you can do as to how to solve that problem. So in the next class my target is to actually elaborate as to how you get the equations of motion of this entire slider crank mechanism. So just to give you a preview of what's coming up in the next class, this is the equation of the motion of the entire mechanism, and you will see that this is that 8 by 8 system which we will now need to solve. So I will set this up for you, but I'll leave the solution process for you as an assignment, not for your examination purpose but for your learning purpose, because you will be able to do this solution only on a computer. It is not recommended you do this on a pen and paper calculation. Do this on a computer as a kind of summer project or hobby project, whatever you might. It will be an eye opener for you that appealing to Newton's laws of motion, you can actually solve problems which are very relevant for the industry. So don't think that we use Newton's laws of motion only to do some very toy kind of problem. We use Newton's laws of motion for very practical and very complicated problem also. So in fact that's the only thing that you should take away. If you know how to use Newton's laws of motion for single body, all that we need now is how to apply this for multiple such bodies. So that is what is given in the slides. If you have gone through it, we will appeal to Newton's laws of motions and draw free body diagram for each and every part, and for each and every part we will determine these equations and then assemble this in a nice form, in a matrix form, so that we can translate all that into computational procedure. To interact with me on that note. Any questions? SPCTB is asking me a question about what is the method of measurement of displacement distance of the crank pin and piston pin. There are very many advanced methods of measurement. Again, as I said, I have posted one sophisticated experimental technique for static dynamic balancing on your course pack. So the experimental methods will depend upon the type of sophistication that you want. There are optical methods available, and however this course is not about a discussion about experimental methods. This is a discussion about dynamics of machine. So I will simply respond to this question by saying that there are methods, and I know of optical methods for example, but at this point I neither know the details nor do I think this is relevant for the discussion, that what are experimental methods for determining the displacement of crank pin and piston pin. But if you search the internet, I am sure you will be able to get relevant literature for your experimental methods. Okay, that's done. Let's move on to the next question, which is the displacement distance between the crank pin as shown by you, is the displacement distance between crank pin? Yeah. SUSCT is asking me whether the displacement is the distance between crank pin and piston pin. Exactly, it is the X, if you have noted in my slide, is actually the distance between the crank pin and the piston pin. The X, this is the crank pin and this is the piston pin, and therefore X is the distance between the crank pin and the piston pin. You have asked what is the whole distance crank pin and the slider pin is not moving. I just don't get what you have written in the chat box. It's better if you come on an interaction and explain yourself. The CTU, you had a question. Could you explain yourself?
I'm asking you that why you have taken the whole distance x for calculating the velocity and the acceleration of the slider, as the slider is not the whole distance between the crank between and the point where the connecting rod and the slider is connected.
I'm afraid, see, what do you mean by whole distance and what is it that is confusing you? I still don't get it. This is my origin. By whole distance, what I mean is that the distance between the slider and the piston, but you are saying the piston is not moving. Why is it that the piston is moving? No, it is undergoing reciprocation. This piston is moving, no? The whole distance is from the crank pin to the piston pin, and the piston is definitely having an upward and downward motion. The piston is not stationary. So I am just finding a function from the piston pin to the crank pin, and the derivative of that function is going to be the velocity. You are saying that the slider is possibly moving only this much, whereas I have taken a position which is from crank pin to here. So your contradiction is that the piston is moving only within a limited range, whereas I have taken the position of the piston from an origin which is the crank pin, and therefore you thought, why is it that I have considered this whole distance whereas the piston is moving only a part of it. See, it is not imperative where you choose the origin of the coordinate system. You can choose the origin anywhere you want to. If you don't like my origin here to be here, put it here if you want to. So if you have another coordinate which is centered around wherever you want, let's say here, which is top dead center of the piston or bottom dead center of the piston, wherever you want. So that coordinate, with respect to that coordinate, you will have the position as x prime, but then x prime and x will differ with a value of a. I'll draw that again for you. I'll draw that in my tablet. So what I have done is I have taken an origin here and my slider is here. So this is my x. Possibly your question is that the BDC for the slider is somewhere here and the TDC for the slider is somewhere here. So therefore you don't like the fact that I have used an origin which is far away from the range of motion of the piston. But my answer to you is the following: even if you choose another origin and call this x prime, so the x prime is, let's say, located at BDC and therefore it satisfies your criteria. The difference between x and x prime is just a constant. So x minus x prime is a, and what is a? This is the distance between the crank pin and the BDC. This is a, right? So therefore x minus x prime is a. So whatever be x dot is same as x prime dot, because the a dot is 0. Similarly, x double dot and x prime double dot is just the same, because a double dot is 0, right. So the expressions for velocity and acceleration are actually independent of the choice of your coordinate system. If you don't like my coordinate system at the crank pin, if you want to put the coordinate system at TDC, BDC, wherever you want, you put it. But though our position will be different, but the velocities will not be different, because velocities are going to be derivative of the position in the prime system and the derivative of the position in my unprimed system, and x dot will still be equal to x dot prime because a does not change with time. So that's the reason why I have used in the crank pin as my origin. It will not affect velocity and acceleration. Thank you. Yeah, we'll take some more questions if you are available. Okay, if there is none, so be it. I think you would have already seen in the course pack the multiple choice questions made available to you. So please practice them. There will be another set which will be visible today, and I would recommend, please take the slides which are available in the course pack and learn about it. The reference for this is the book by Ghosh and Malik, Theory of Mechanisms. So if in fact any other book is just as good, but I follow Ghosh and Malik. So please read this stuff, because that will be useful for you. You can complement the lecture material well. That's as per the schedule. So we'll have the closing discussions and we'll actually solve out the single cylinder balancing problem entirely for you. We will just throw some hints as to how to approach the multi-cylinder inline engines, because time will not permit to have a full detailed discussion around multi-cylinder engines. I hope you like the material. If there are any questions, please post the questions in the forum available in the course pack. So I will respond to the questions as soon as as I get to know about them. With that, let's call it a day here. Thank you and see you again on Monday.